The development of the European history of ideas in the 17th and 18th centuries is known as the Age of Enlightenment. Reason, self-determination, science and education, these were recognized as fundamental values. People were turning away from religious fanaticism, superstition, and the arbitrary exercise of power. The emergence of human rights and citizens' rights dates from this period. In the Habsburg Empire, the ideas of the Enlightenment were taken up in the second half of the 18th century. Enlightenment in the time of Maria Theresia appeared above all in the form of a centralistic, rationalized administration, in the development of a new and disciplined habit of thinking. This had the pragmatic aim of combining responsibilities and enabling the state to act more efficiently. The substantial power of the Jesuits was sharply eroded. Censorship fell into the hands of the state. Maria Theresia also created a high court of justice and introduced education in schools.
The exhibits on display in this part of the exhibition show the most important enlightened personalities representing absolutism in the time of Maria Theresa. Unlike France, Germany and England, there were no philosophers in Austria who wrote fundamental theoretical texts on enlightenment. Enlightened thinkers in Vienna mostly took a pragmatic approach in their writings. Many practical guidelines were compiled which were based on the principles of the Enlightenment and influenced people's day-to-day life.
Mozart, like his father, was well acquainted with the new ideas of the Enlightenment. From the personal effects left at his death, we know some of the books that Mozart possessed. Among them were important writings about the Enlightenment, such as the collected works of Sonnenfels. Moreover, we can assume that as a later member of a Freemasons' lodge, he was extremely well informed about contemporary philosophical and political discussions.
Now there's just enough time to tell you quickly that we were received by their Majesties so extraordinarily well that when I relate it, people will think I'm making it up. Enough. Little Wolfgang jumped onto the Empress's lap, threw his arms around her neck and kissed her profusely. In brief, we were there from 3 to 6, and the Emperor himself came out of the other room to fetch me to hear the Infanta playing the violin. On the 15th, the Privy Treasurer came by order of the Empress, and he appeared in ceremonial dress outside our house. He brought 2 dresses, one for the boy and one for the girl.
Van Swieten was one of the most important philosophers of the Enlightenment. His personality was described as energetic and determined. Contemporaries such as the Austrian State Chancellor Count Kaunitz, who is also honoured as a philosopher of the Enlightenment in this exhibition, even called Van Swieten a rough and uncouth person, who audaciously flouted the etiquette of Maria Theresia's court. Franz Xaver Messerschmitt sculpted a portrait of the opinionated doctor. The artist made no attempt in his work to idealize the doctor's physiognomy. The bullish face is very realistic. The jutting chin and the squashed wig are faithfully recorded. With his unsparing eye for details and the courage to portray them in all their ugliness, Messerschmitt paved the way to modernity in the visual arts.
Anton Graf, painter at the Dresden court, shows us the portrait of Josef Freiherr von Sonnenfels. Until the end of the 18th century, his writings on society, the state and the economy were regarded as the basis for studying at university. Sonnenfels was a committed opponent of torture and expressed his sentiments in his famous and momentous essay on the abolition of torture. You can see this and other texts in the exhibition. Sonnenfels was an ardent supporter of the reform of German theatre. In Vienna at that time there was a German and a French theatre. At the Vienna Burgtheater, the plays performed in French were highly regarded by the aristocratic public, for whom the French language was part of their everyday way of life. Unlike the French theatre, the majority of plays performed at the German theatre were impromptu pieces that appealed to a broader public.
Sonnenfels wanted to raise the standard of German theatre, which he saw as a key institution in the cultivation of morality, custom and rationality. He demanded stricter theatre censorship and the prohibition of any kind of improvised plays. And Sonnenfels was successful. Improvised theatre, an authentic expression of decades of Viennese theatre tradition, was banned. From this time on, so-called regular plays prevailed, which meant that stage performances followed a strictly predetermined text. Mozart travelled in Italy between 1769 and 1773. Apart from his performances and other engagements, he also had time for tourist trips. In this respect, his travels are reminiscent of the Grand Tour. This term describes an educational journey to the cities of classical antiquity, virtually compulsory for young men of the aristocracy in the 18th century. Mozart visited Venice, Padua, Vicenza, Rome, Naples. There he also visited the excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum. The following paintings and documents take you into the world of the late 18th century, and also show you how painters from outside Italy saw this country. You will see how impressively the world of the theatre merges with the dramatization of life. I hope you will enjoy this Italian journey. For musical accompaniment, you will have the first movement of the String Quartet No. 5, which Mozart wrote in this period. It is played by the Quartetto Italiano. Giovanni Domenico Tiepolo was one of the most important Rococo painters. His frescoes decorate the grandest palaces in Italy. His masterpiece is in Venice. In this oil painting, Tiepolo shows a convivial scene. All the figures are wearing masks and elaborate costumes. They form a semicircle with a central couple dancing to music. You can see the man dressed in red swinging his leg in the air to the beat of the music. Have you discovered the orchestra in the crowd, on the right at the back? By placing the orchestra in the background, Tiepolo's painting makes clear the social standing of the musicians.
An extensive culture of masking evolved in Venice in the 18th century. There were strict social rules for the wearing of masks. In the play of concealing and revealing, or between reality and fiction, there's always an underlying erotic element.
Christoph Willibald Gluck was born in the Oberpfalz in 1714. For his musical achievements he received the Order of the Golden Spur. So, like Mozart, he was in possession of the highest temporal award in the gift of the Vatican. But the order he received was in a lesser class than Mozart's. And there was another difference. From that time onwards, Gluck, unlike Mozart, always used the title Knight in his name. Gluck was regarded as one of the greatest reformers of traditional opera seria. The first of these reform works, Orpheus and Eurydice and Alceste, were composed for Vienna, and the later ones, Iphigenie in Aulis and Iphigenie in Tauris, for Paris. One of his major aims was as far as possible to avoid interrupting the musical flow of an opera. Gluck was not interested in virtuoso singing. He wanted to use music to bring drama onto the stage. Mozart and Gluck met several times. Their relationship was rather cool, however, Gluck being 42 years older, and their musical paths were very different.
Now there's just enough time to tell you quickly that we were received by their Majesties so extraordinarily well that when I relate it, people will think I'm making it up. Enough. Little Wolfgang jumped onto the Empress's lap, threw his arms around her neck and kissed her profusely. In brief, we were there from 3 to 6, and the emperor himself came out of the other room to fetch me to hear the Infanta playing the violin. On the 15th, the privy treasurer came by order of the empress, and he appeared in ceremonial dress outside our house. He brought 2 dresses, one for the boy and one for the girl.
This part of the exhibition presents you with a picture of Paris at the time of Mozart. Paris was without doubt the cultural capital of Europe. In fashion as well as lifestyle, Paris was predominant. The numerous illustrations demonstrate the rococo aesthetic and show how galanterie was the predominant form of behavior for society. It will also show the importance of Paris as an intellectual center at this time. Thinkers from Paris influenced cultural and political discourse throughout Europe. It was here that many fundamental ideas of the Enlightenment were developed and made public.
A new social figure was on the agenda in French society. Rulers now liked to be in the company of philosophers and thinkers. It was primarily Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire who corresponded for several years with the rulers of Europe, such as Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great. Busts of both philosophers are on display here. Denis Diderot was the third major 18th century personality in Paris. His encyclopedia brought together the whole wealth of knowledge of his time.
Here we meet the hot air balloon once again. It is a symbol for crossing borders and opening up new spaces. Nature is no longer a natural expanse, but is also seen as a construction. Now I want to jump from the hideous to the delightful, in fact to something which delighted a king. Surely you also want to know what Madame Marquise Pompadour looks like, don't you? Well, she must really have been very beautiful, as she is still pretty fine. She is a large, handsome person, generously built but well proportioned, blonde, rather reminiscent of Therese Fresauf, now known as Tresel, and her eyes have something of the Empress about them. She does herself much honour and is extraordinarily intelligent.
In order to survive as a freelance artist, Mozart organized academies and subscription concerts. The system of subscriptions functioned in those days as it does now. Clients paid money and thus bought the right to attend a series of concerts. On display here is a list of the concert subscribers. Mozart proudly sent it to his father. As you can see, they were mostly members of the higher and lesser nobility. Here you can see the autograph manuscript of the so-called dissonance quartet. Listen to the dissonant intervals that gave the quartet its name. The Dissonance Quartet was an acoustic challenge for Mozart's contemporaries. It's one of a series of 6-string quartets, all of which Mozart dedicated to Joseph Haydn.
Look, illustrious man and dearest friend, here are my 6 children. They are truly the result of long and painstaking work. I hope you will therefore be kind enough to accept them and be a father, guide and friend to them.
The income from the academies and subscription concerts allowed Mozart to have quite a luxurious lifestyle, and as a freelance artist he still had another source of income, the sale of prints of his compositions. People in Vienna first took notice of Mozart as an opera composer through performances of Die Entführung aus dem Serail, The Abduction from the Seraglio. Mozart was not a typical opera composer. Compared to other composers such as Giovanni Paisiello, who was famous at the time, he wrote only a relatively small number of operas. Die Entführung aus dem Serail was commissioned by Emperor Joseph II for the German Singspiel. This new form of opera was not systematically encouraged until 1778, and the aim was to establish it alongside Italian opera. However, the German Singspiel achieved no permanence. In 1783, Italian opera was reintroduced at the Burgtheater in Vienna. Mozart experienced an enormous success with Die Entführung aus dem Serail, and it was subsequently performed at several German theatres, even though the great artificiality of the music came in for some criticism.
The singers are Fritz Wunderlich, Erike Köth, Lotti Schädel and Friedrich Lenz. The orchestra of the Bavarian State Opera is playing under the baton of Eugen Jochem.
Liebstes Blau
You probably already saw the portrait of Emperor Joseph II from a distance. His slim figure and thin face reflect self-discipline and rationality. He is a central personality in the latter part of the 18th century. The reforms he introduced and carried out with great speed and determination were inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment. Transparency, rationality, reason and tolerance were the foundations of his orders.
Joseph II continued the endeavour to centralize the state, which had begun under Maria Theresia. He came into conflict with the various cultures within his empire. His radical interventions in the festive cultures and traditions of his people cost him a great deal of sympathy, even among those social classes whose lot he was trying to improve. With the establishment of a wider freedom of the press, a completely new kind of social discourse emerged in Vienna. Numerous brochures appeared, which discussed many political, religious and social questions with an openness previously unknown.
In the surrounding area, you can see the allegorical creations of the enlightened emperor. Many examples of his radical reforms of state and society are exhibited here. Please observe the patents of tolerance which permitted the practice of non-Catholic religions. You can also see the orders by which he abolished all the monasteries that did not meet any recognizable social purpose. The orders regulating a new form of burial are also on display. However, the ban on burial in a wooden coffin led to such intense protests that Joseph had to withdraw his order.
But Josephinism also meant the opening up of spaces in a social sense. He threw open to the public parks which had previously been closed, and allowed paying members of the middle classes to celebrate parties in the ballrooms.
Several copper engravings convey an idea of day-to-day aesthetics in Vienna under Emperor Joseph. Many are by Hieronymus Löschenkohl, a graphic artist and publisher who depicted many events of his time. Please observe the slender, simple forms of items of practical use exhibited here. In terms of style, they look far ahead to the future.
The importance of religion was the subject of much discussion within the framework of the European Enlightenment. In Vienna, these discussions took place above all in the lodges of the Freemasons. Interest shifted from the theological question of the truth of religious revelation to the question of the social function of religion. And many thinkers of the Enlightenment came out in favour of religion not because they believed in its teachings, but because they considered these necessary to hold society together.
Joseph tried to limit the impact of the formerly so powerful Catholic Church to pastoral aspects. The intention was for pragmatic morality to dominate. He strictly forbade all forms of Baroque affected piety and corresponding rituals.
This is the context for exhibiting the shoes you see before you. They belong to Pope Pius VI. Pius VI travelled to Vienna in 1782 to persuade the emperor to abandon his reform course. Joseph wanted to avoid attracting any sort of attention and arranged a sober reception for the Pope on open ground. You can see this scene depicted in a copperplate engraving.
Nevertheless, Joseph could not avoid the Pope being celebrated in the streets of the royal capital by the people, who regarded his visit as a sensation. Many were anxious to be given an audience and wanted to kiss the Pope's shoes. In order to make this possible, the Pope's shoes were put on show separately. The history of these shoes symbolizes people's ambivalent reception of the reform process under Emperor Joseph.
You can see before you the father, Leopold Mozart, and his children. They are making music. Leopold plays the violin, Wolfgang sits at the piano. Have you noticed that the boy's feet don't reach the floor? He was just 8 years old. His sister, Maria Anna Walburga Ignatia, known as Nannel, is singing from a sheet of music. Nannel was 4 years older than her brother. Until her 16th birthday, the children were inseparable. Side by side, they impressed their listeners with their virtuoso piano playing. At 16, Nannel became too old to appear as a child prodigy. She remained in Salzburg. She composed too, like Mozart. However, her compositions were not performed in public. She was greatly admired as a piano teacher. The lively, intimate and playful correspondence between brother and sister can tell us a lot today, not only about Wolfgang's development, but also about the unconstrained and cheerful relationship between the two. She jokingly used a variety of names for her brother: Flegel, Laut, Spitzbub, Scamp, and Hanswurst, Clown, for example. He called her by the nicknames Zizibe and Königin, Queen, and for kisses he sent her by post 100 smackers. Wolfgang relied heavily on Nannel's literary and musical judgment. His sister took charge of the complete edition of her brother's works after his death. Nannel died in Salzburg at the age of 78.
Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgang Theophilus Mozart was born on January the 27th, 1756 in Salzburg. His baptized name Wolfgang became the name he was called by. The Greek name Theophilus is Gottlieb in German, and Mozart later translated this into the Latin form Amadeus, and then finally into French, Amadée. He referred to himself as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Wolfgang gave himself many names, but never the name Amadeus.
Wolfgang jumped onto the Empress's lap, put his arms round her neck and smothered her in kisses.
You're listening to the first movement of the sonata in B-flat major for piano and flute, Köchel number 10. Mozart wrote the sonata at the age of 8. The famous landscape painter and portraitist Thomas Gainsborough depicted the renowned composer and musician Johann Christian Bach in a light, translucent painting technique. The portrait shows Bach in ornate clothing. He was about 50 years old when this painting was made. Bach turns the upper part of his body slightly away from us. Please try to find his gaze. It's directed inwards, as if he were concentrating on listening to music. He's holding a piece of music in his hand. Johann Christian Bach was much in demand as a musician and composer. He was Johann Sebastian Bach's 11th child, and he was taught by his famous father, later on by his older brother Philipp Emanuel. In Italy, Johann Christian was educated by Padre Martini. You'll come across this person again in the exhibition. Ultimately, Johann Christian was engaged by the English royal household in London. This was where he first met the child prodigy Wolfgang Mozart. Mozart admired Johann Christian Bach. He referred to him as his father and teacher. Indeed, besides his father Leopold, Johann Christian Bach was the most influential figure for the young Mozart. The child prodigies Wolfgang and Nannerl Mozart captured the hearts of their listeners. The Mozart family was invited to the banqueting table of King Louis XV on New Year's Day. The children performed music to entertain the guests. Leopold described the great occasion.
The most extraordinary thing was that my Wolfgangus had the honour to stand next to the Queen, talk to her constantly, entertain her, kiss her hands repeatedly, and eat the dishes she served him from the table while standing beside her. The Queen speaks German as well as we do. As the King speaks none at all, however, the Queen translated for him everything our heroic Wolfgang said. I stood next to him. On the other side of the King, where Monsieur Dauphin and Mademoiselle Adélaïde sat, stood my wife and my daughter.
Leopold Mozart was an excellent teacher. He gave his children a broad general education and also taught them Latin, French, and Italian. His children never went to school. Lessons took place at home, while they were travelling in the carriage, or wherever they were staying. Leopold Mozart was born in Augsburg. He attended the Jesuit school in his hometown and studied theology, philosophy, and jurisprudence. However, his violin playing brought him an appointment as valet to the Salzburg canon Count Thurn und Taxis. Leopold was then engaged by the Salzburg Court Orchestra as a violinist, and eventually he became a fully employed violinist with a fixed salary. Leopold achieved particular recognition for his treatise on the fundamental principles of violin playing, which was published in Augsburg. The first edition appeared in 1756, the year of Mozart's birth. As you can see, the title in German of the instructions on technique and musical taste still contains the word Versuch, attempt, at a school. Over the years, this publication became increasingly popular and even more successful, so that Versuch disappeared from later editions. 2 German versions of the violin school were published. In the following year, one in Dutch. In the year 1770, the violin tutor was translated into French and eventually into Russian.
From 1782, Mozart lived in Vienna as a freelance musician and composer. Among other things, he also earned money as a piano teacher. His lessons were extremely expensive. In front of you is the lesson notebook of Barbara Ployer. The bundle contains 13 sheets with exercises in harmony. Barbara Ployer was a good pianist, and Mozart composed 2 piano concertos for her. At the age of 12, Mozart composed his first full-length opera. Joseph II gave him the encouragement for this. It bears the title La finta semplice, the simulated simpleton. Contrary to expectations, however, Mozart was perceived not as a charming child prodigy, but as a competitor and business rival. For the first time, Mozart was criticized. Many refused to believe that he had written the opera himself and maintained that it was the work of his father. It was alleged that the music was undramatic and that the 12-year-old could have no feeling for the subject. There were delays and the performances were repeatedly postponed. One of the principal singers died of smallpox. Leopold complained in writing to Joseph about the postponing tactics, to no avail. In the end, the opera was cancelled.
To make up for this, and as some consolation, Mozart was finally allowed to perform the Waisenhausmesse, which he had composed for the opening of the Waisenhaus church on the Rennweg in Vienna. You can see the original manuscript of this highly regarded mass in the display case. You can recognize the Missa Solemnis by the 12-lined manuscript paper. You can also see the Waisenhaus church here too. It's depicted in a copper engraving by Josef Kolonetz.
The failure of the opera La Finta Semplice soon made it clear that Mozart was unlikely to be successful in Vienna. The recognition he deserved came from the south. The father exploited his contacts and arranged a journey to Italy.
Please look at the score of the opera La Finta Semplice. The musical notes written by the young boy seem to be a little clumsy. The note heads are large and give the impression of having been painted rather than written. In later autograph manuscripts, you'll see that Mozart's notation flows smoothly. La Finta Semplice is Mozart's first opera buffa, his first comic opera. The story is complicated and full of intricate plots and deceptions. Two brothers living in seclusion in the country are thrown into turmoil by the arrival of guests. Liaisons are faked in order to cover up other amorous attachments. After a duel and much excitement, the third act ends happily.
Joseph II, who had commissioned the opera, also suggested to Mozart that he conducted himself. That was extremely unusual. The normal practice was for the leader of the orchestra to give the beat from the first violins. All the other musicians then followed his lead. From this point of view, it is understandable that the musicians didn't fancy the idea of being conducted by a 12-year-old. It is not certain when the first performance of the opera took place. Several sources mention a performance in Salzburg in 1769. The work had no influence on the course of Mozart's career. Mozart had no success in finding a position at an Italian court, and returned to Salzburg in 1773, where he stayed initially for another 4 years. Although Mozart hated Salzburg, he wrote brilliant masterpieces there, such as the Jeune Homme piano concerto, composed for the daughter of the famous choreographer Noverre. A few bars of the piano concerto will give you an impression of it.
Unlike Schrattenbach, who died in 1771, Prince Archbishop Colloredo allowed the Mozarts hardly any freedom to travel. In 1777, Mozart resigned from service in Salzburg. You can see Mozart's letter of resignation in the display case. For the first time in his life, Mozart travelled without his father, but accompanied by his mother. This journey took him to Munich, Augsburg, Mannheim and Paris. Father Leopold, writing letters from Salzburg, tried to steer the path of his son.
The object of your journey had 2 causes. First of all, to look for a good permanent position, or, should this be unsuccessful, to go to a major centre where your fame and fortune can be made. Behind both of these was the intention to support your parents and to promote your sister, but above all to bring fame and honour to yourself in the world. You owe this to the extraordinary talent given to you by the grace of God.
Mozart didn't succeed in finding an appointment either at the court in Munich or in Mannheim, where the princely personages responded to his requests merely by shrugging their shoulders. And so he set off for Paris, where he was helped by the old family friend Baron Friedrich Melchior Grimm. However, Mozart felt rather too much under his thumb. You can see portraits of Grimm in the showcases. The letter is also on display in which Mozart conceals the news of his mother's death from his father. Mozart was unsuccessful in establishing himself in the musical life of Paris. On the orders of his father, he returned to the service of the disliked Prince Archbishop.
My Lord and gracious Prince, parents do their best to put their children in a position to earn their own bread, and this is a duty for the sake of both the children and the state. The more talent God has granted to the children, the more they are obliged to put it to good use, in order to improve the circumstances of themselves and their parents, and to provide for the future.
This was the argument Mozart used to pave the way for resigning his service from Prince Archbishop Colloredo. Listen to how Mozart continues the letter.
I trust that your Excellency will therefore allow me to humbly beg to be released from your service, since I am obliged to make use of the last month of autumn in order not to be cruelly exposed to the bitter weather of the succeeding months.
The conciliatory ending of the letter cannot conceal the audacity with which a self-assured composer resigned.
I thank your Excellency most humbly for all the examples of your gracious benevolence towards me, and in the flattering hope of serving you with greater approbation in my years of maturity, I look forward to the highest and most gracious favours in the future. I remain, my Lord and most gracious Prince, your most faithful and obedient servant, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I have been to Italy 3 times, have written 3 operas, am a member of the Academy in Bologna, have passed an exam over which many maestros have worked and sweated for 4 or 5 hours. I finished it in 1 hour. This may serve as a reference that I am able to serve in any court. My only wish, however, is to serve your princely highness, who is himself so great.
My dear child, there's no vacancy here. I'm sorry. If only a position were free.
I assure your highness that I would certainly bring honor to Munich.
Yes, there's nothing to be done. There's no vacancy here.
The opera seria Idomeneo Re di Creta was one of Mozart's favourite works. The Bavarian elector Karl Theodor commissioned Mozart to write this opera for the carnival season in Munich. Mozart received a short term of leave from his employer Colloredo. Mozart enjoyed composing for the former Mannheim orchestra that Karl Theodor had taken with him when he moved from Mannheim to Munich. It had the reputation of being the best ensemble in Europe. Mozart is very inventive in Idomeneo. Choruses of great dramatic effect are introduced. The music has many levels and is rich in nuances. It not only underlines the drama of what is happening on stage, it is in itself pure drama.
Idomeneo is set in Crete, shortly after the Trojan War. In the first act, we await the arrival of Idomeneo, king of Crete. The news of his return is received with joy, and the imprisoned Trojans are set free. Among them is Ilia, who loves the king's son, Idamante. Idomeneo's return is, however, prevented at the last moment by the sea god Neptune. Idomeneo placates the god with a vow to sacrifice the first person that he meets on land. Tragically, his first encounter is with his own son, Idamante. In the second act, Idomeneo attempts to protect his son. He tries, unsuccessfully, to get him to leave the island. Neptune sends a monster, which destroys the fleet. In the third act, the people of Crete call on Idomeneo to sacrifice his son in the temple, although Idamante has killed the monster. Everything is prepared for the human sacrifice. But before it can be carried out, the voice of the oracle rings out and pronounces that Neptune will be appeased forever if Idomeneo gives up his crown to Idamante and Ilia.
You're listening to the aria Fuor del Mar from Act 2 of the opera Idomeneo. Singing the role of Idomeneo is Placido Domingo. The Metropolitan Opera Orchestra is conducted by James Levine.
Anna Maria Walburger-Pertl was 36 years old when she gave birth to her seventh and last child, Wolfgang. 5 of her children had died. Nannerl was the only daughter to reach adulthood. Mozart's mother was described as a down-to-earth, humorous and caring housewife. On the journey to Paris, Mozart had not only freed himself from his absent father, but often from his mother too. In Paris, she complained insistently about her isolation, about being cooped up in her room, while her son pursued his interests and attended to professional matters.
As regards my way of life, it's not at all pleasant. I sit at home all day alone, as if I were in prison. The room is so dark, and the whole day long I cannot see the sun, and I don't even know what the weather is like outside. I do not see Wolfgang all day, and I will completely forget how to speak.
After a short but severe illness, Mozart's mother died in Paris. She is buried in the cemetery of Saint-Eustache.
Anna Maria Mozart died on July 3rd, 1778. She had been taken ill 2 weeks earlier. Mozart was confronted with the difficult task of informing his father about her death. Listen to what Mozart wrote to his father on the day his mother died.
Monsieur mon très cher père, I must give you some very unpleasant and sad news, which is also the reason why I was unable to answer your last letter dated the 11th until now. My dear mother is very ill.
Mozart did not dare to tell his father the truth. He asked a friend of the family to prepare his father for the sad news. It was not until July the 9th that Mozart found enough courage and again took up his quill.
Monsieur mon très cher père, I hope that you are prepared to hear with steadfastness the saddest and most painful news. My last letter of the 3rd will have warned you that the news might not be good. On the same day, the 3rd, my mother passed away at 21 minutes past 10 in the evening. God rest her soul. When I wrote to you, she was already enjoying the blessings of heaven. It was already over. I wrote to you in the night. I hope you and my dear sister will forgive this small and very necessary deception, as after imagining your pain and sorrow in the light of my own, I could not find it in my heart to surprise you with this dreadful news.
In 1781, Prince Archbishop Colloredo and his court went to Vienna. Mozart was still in Munich at the time, but he was ordered to Vienna. Mozart felt severely limited by Colloredo in his freedom of movement in Vienna. It became ever more apparent to him that he no longer wanted to return to Salzburg. After a confrontation, Mozart wanted to resign and handed his letter of resignation to Count Arco, the most senior courtier in the Salzburg entourage. The Count's patience was soon stretched to its limits. Listen to what Mozart wrote to his father.
Instead of Count Arco accepting my letter, or arranging an audience for me, or advising me to leave things as they are and think again, no, he throws me out of the door and gives me a kick in the arse. Well, this means I shall have nothing more to do with Salzburg, unless, of course, I get the chance of kicking the noble Count in the arse in return, even if this should take place on the open street.
Full of self-assurance, Mozart wrote 7 days later.
The heart ennobles the man, and even if I am not a count, perhaps I have more honour in me than many a nobleman. And whoever he is, servant or count, as soon as he starts abusing me, he's a scoundrel.
In this part of the exhibition, you can see the correspondence between father and son documenting the conflict with Colloredo. The Prince Archbishop is shown in a painting. You can feel his bodily presence by means of his deerskin gloves. Even before his ultimate break with the Salzburg court, Mozart had assessed the situation as follows.
Vienna is the best place for my profession.
Se vuol ballare, signor Contino, se vuol ballare, signor Contino, il chitarrino le suonerò.
Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro caused a huge sensation. This opera is based on a play by Beaumarchais, which, however, Emperor Joseph II had prohibited from being performed. You can see the leaflet by Joseph II in which he banned the play only 2 days before the premiere was due to take place in the Kärntner Tor Theatre. Even though the play was now prohibited on stage, it was still on sale in print. The new liberality on the book market was not yet matched by similar freedom for the stage. Lorenzo da Ponte made a libretto from the play.
Mozart had waited a long time for a libretto like this. He suggested the subject to Lorenzo da Ponte himself at their first meeting. Da Ponte succeeded in persuading the emperor to allow the performance of the forbidden theatre piece in a new version as an Italian opera. On May 1st, 1786, the work had its first performance in Vienna. In the preface to the libretto, Lorenzo da Ponte claimed to have created a new form of comedy in music. The opera was performed on stage 9 times in the year of its premiere. This was a respectable success. When it was revived in 1789, Figaro became a real success with the public. Soon after the premiere in Vienna, Figaro was performed with great success in Prague.
You can hear the turbulent finale of Figaro. The soloists are Eberhard Wächter, Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, Anna Moffo, Giuseppe Taddei, Fiorenzo Cosotto, Ivo Vinco, Doraio Gatta and Renato Ervolani. Carlo Maria Giulini conducts the Philharmonia Orchestra.
Gente, gente, allarmi, allarmi, il padrone. Gente, gente, aiuto, aiuto, son perduto. Il scellerato m'ha tradito, m'hai chiamato, ecco chi sta a vedere. Son storditi, spalorditi, oh che sceso, che piacere. In van resistete, uscite malama, in premio l'avrete di vostra onestà. Il peggio, mia figlia, mia madre, scoperta è la trama, la perfida è qua, la perfida è qua. Perdono, perdono, no, no, non sperarlo, perdono, perdono, no, non sperarlo.
The genre painting by Pietro Longhi depicts a carnival scene. The Venetian artist has shown the masked persons with great sophistication. The lady wearing the white dress turns towards the observer. She's holding a mask in her hands. A masked man approaches her from behind. He enfolds her figure with his black cape, which makes an impressive contrast. In the background, another couple can be seen. Both persons are wearing masks. Longhi plays with the contrasts. Just observe his subtle use of colours. The painter is famous for his delicate, small-format genre pictures characterised by vivid colours. His favourite subjects are the forms of social gallantry. The artist died in 1785 in Venice.
Finca dal vino calda la testa, una gran festa fa preparar. Se trovi in piazza qualche ragazza, te con quella cerca menar, te con quella.
This display case treats the story of the Don Juan subject matter. The story originally came from Spain. It's about 400 years old and was staged again and again throughout Europe in many variations. The central figure in this story is Don Juan, in Italian Don Giovanni. He is an unscrupulous womanizer with no decency or morals, and he invites the statue of the man he murdered to dine with him. This has fatal consequences. Don Giovanni goes to hell, but beforehand he defies the power of the supernatural. In more or less heroic defiance, he refuses to repent and give up his life as a seducer and playboy. As theatre history shows, his descent to hell has brought him immortality, especially in the characteristic portrayal given to this stage figure by da Ponte and Mozart.
In Vienna, there was a long tradition of presenting a staged version of the Don Juan story once a year at All Souls. This tradition was ended when it was forbidden by decree in 1769. The main figure in this extemporized German play was not Don Juan, but his servant Hanswurst.
Opera took up this subject matter at a time when the play no longer seemed worthy of performance. About 10 years before the premiere of Mozart's Don Giovanni, the story slowly began to conquer the operatic stage. Several Don Juan operas appeared. In Prague and in Naples, for instance, but above all in Venice, where in this period 3 Don Juan operas were first performed. The Venetian operas in particular take a very distanced approach to the subject matter. In one opera that was performed about 6 months before Mozart's Don Giovanni, an opera company discusses in a kind of prelude whether Don Juan can indeed still be performed. The impresario answers with a definite yes, and the actual story is seen in the following act as a kind of play within a play.
In Mozart's time, the Don Juan theme was a popular one in provincial theatre. The audience looked forward to the stars of the theatre in the Leopoldstadt, and particularly to the appearance of the comic Kaspar, the successor to Hanswurst. Don Giovanni was first performed in Prague on the 29th of October 1787. The history of the origins of this Mozart opera is documented in this showcase. As you can see from the text shown here, Don Giovanni was originally conceived as a gala performance in honour of the Grand Duchess Maria Theresia. She was the niece of the Emperor and the daughter of Leopold, the Archduke of Tuscany, a later successor to Leopold II. As in the case of The Marriage of Figaro, Lorenzo da Ponte wrote an outstanding libretto. This gala performance never took place, however. The premiere was postponed. In this first version of the libretto, almost half of the first act is missing. Could it be that this was the result of censorship? We still don't know the answer. The origins of the opera also remain obscure to this day.
In the end, the postponed premiere in Prague was very successful. It is highly probable that Giacomo Casanova was among the audience. In the 20th century, 2 sketches were found in his estate, which give alternative versions for Leporello's escape aria in Act 2. This poem by Casanova is exhibited here in the display case. It is not known what Casanova intended in writing these texts. In the first version, he has Leporello say that in fact Don Giovanni is the victim of the female sex, the seductive sex that enchants the heart. For the first performance in Vienna in 1788, the libretto and the music were slightly modified. Listen to the duet "Give Me Your Hand, My Beloved," sung by George London and Irmgard Seyfried. The Vienna State Opera Orchestra is conducted by Karl Böhm.
Auf mein Schloss mit mir. Mein Herz, sag es mir. Es ist nicht weit von hier. Oh, zittern still. Lass nicht umsonst. Zittern still. Soll ich still. Kann ich wieder streben. Komm wieder streben. Komm wieder streben.
Mozart enjoyed great success in this city, and his music was very highly regarded here. The Symphony No. 38 in D major, Köchel No. 504, was premiered during Mozart's first stay in Prague at the beginning of 1787. It is known as the Prague Symphony. 2 of his operas, Don Giovanni and La Clemenza di Tito, were premiered in Prague, the latter at the time of Leopold II's coronation as King of Bohemia. Nevertheless, this coronation opera was not well received at court. However, during his first visit to Prague, Mozart had a great success with his Marriage of Figaro, which was performed there in the same year as the premiere in Vienna.
Here the people talk about nothing but Figaro. Nothing is played, sung or whistled except Figaro. The only opera people go to is Figaro and more Figaro. Certainly a great honour for me.
Panorama images convey an idea of how the city looked during Mozart's time. What life was like in the city is characterized in fashion journals and furniture catalogues of the period. For Mozart, the year 1787 was marked by many different occurrences. He was enthusiastically acclaimed on his first trip to Prague at the beginning of the year. Inwardly, he was making preparations to move to England, a plan which was never fulfilled. He was commissioned to compose Don Giovanni. In the middle of May, his father Leopold died.
It was also the year in which the 31-year-old composer wrote the Kleine Nachtmusik. And it was the year when he finally obtained a position at court. Mozart was appointed the Emperor's chamber musician.
The salary of 800 gulden, that was about the same amount a senior consultant would have earned at that time at the General Hospital, was not enough to meet Mozart's needs. Until the end of his life, he continued to write letters to his Masonic brother in the lodge, asking for money. Puchberg was a loyal supporter of Mozart. He lent him a total of 510 gulden. Mozart's luxurious lifestyle, and probably his passion for gambling, meant that he was constantly short of money. Nevertheless, this in no way meant that Mozart had to live in poverty. The year came to an end with news of a completely different kind. A daughter was born on December the 27th. Teresa was the fourth of 6 children in all. Only 2 sons lived to adulthood.
In the 1780s, a select group formed around Baron van Swieten, which had a highly unusual interest, a soft spot for early music. On Sundays, the group met in the court library of van Swieten's apartment and played Bach and Handel. It was also van Swieten who requested Mozart to make arrangements of 4 works by the composer George Frederick Handel. Among these was the opera Acis and Galatea and the oratorio Alexander's Feast. Here you can see the autograph of Mozart's version. The alterations and amendments are written in red ink.
It was certainly not unusual for Mozart and his contemporaries to adapt these pieces of early music to the prevailing Zeitgeist by making changes in the composition. During the 18th century, there was hardly any kind of performance practice of early music, whose composers were already dead. Brand new pieces, or works not much older than 15 years, were performed at the theatres. Despite this form of fostering the musical heritage, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, from his own point of view, could not yet have any clear idea of what impact his former constant presence in musical life and in the cultural memory was to have.
In front of you is the autographed score of the opera Così fan tutti. Così fan tutti is the last joint opera production of Da Ponte and Mozart. The libretto was originally intended for Antonio Salieri. It is not known why he turned down the project. The opera was first performed in January 1790, just a month before the death of Joseph II, and it was given 10 performances in that year. This was a respectable rather than a sensational success. Così fan tutti is an opera informed by the experimental Enlightenment. It deals with most of the important themes of the day. By the ingenious use of traditional set pieces of opera buffa, it promotes radical dramaturgical solutions. The opera was heavily criticized in the 19th century for being amoral and illogical. Today, it is regarded as one of the most subtle works in the operatic repertoire. You can hear a short extract from the opera Così fan tutti. It's the duet for Fiordiligi and Dorabella from the first act. Elisabeth Schwarzkopf and Christa Ludwig are accompanied by the Philharmonia Orchestra under Karl Böhm. The young Prince Tamino finds himself in the realm of the Queen of the Night. She shows him a portrait of her kidnapped daughter Pamina. This portrait is bewitchingly beautiful. Tamino falls in love with Pamina. The Queen promises him the hand of her daughter if Tamino rescues her from the palace of Sarastro. He is given a magic flute for his protection. The bird-catcher Papageno goes with Tamino. He is given a wonderful glockenspiel. 3 boys show Tamino and Papageno the way. In Sarastro's kingdom, Tamino learns from a priest that Sarastro is a wise man and no villain. Pamina was kidnapped in order to remove her from what Sarastro sees as the corruptive influence of her mother. Pamina and Papageno try in vain to escape from Sarastro's kingdom. Sarastro forgives their attempt to escape. Tamino is led away to undergo the tests of character which will qualify him for admission to the sacred circle. Papageno follows unwillingly.
In the second act, some ritual trials are introduced on stage. For instance, the command to remain silent, regardless of what is going on around them. The Queen of the Night orders her daughter to kill Sarastro and to bring her the sevenfold circle of the sun. One part of the trials that Tamino has to go through is to remain silent. Pamina thinks that Tamino does not love her anymore because he no longer speaks to her. In despair, she intends to kill herself. She is saved, like Papageno, who in a circuitous way finds the love of his life. Tamino and Pamina go through the trials of fire and water together. Admission to the Temple of Wisdom is granted to them. An attempted revolt by the Queen of the Night is thwarted. She and her entourage plunge into eternal night. In the celebratory chorus of jubilation, Tamino and Pamina are blessed by Sarastro in the circle of his priests and are accepted into the temple order. Carl Friedrich Schinkel designed the most impressive stage sets for Mozart's Magic Flute. They are very different from the stage designs we know about from the late 18th century. Garden landscapes become Egyptomanic pictures. Please look at the series of stage designs which have been assembled here. Schinkel was born in 1781. He was an architect. His writings on the theory of architecture are even more important. Stylistically, Carl Friedrich Schinkel is ascribed to classicism. He made the sketches for the stage sets of the Magic Flute in 1816. They were immediately a great success, which meant that Schinkel received frequent commissions to design sets for the theatre.
Schinkel set the action in Egypt. This can be clearly seen by the figure of the Sphinx. The palm trees and the figures of sentinels in the foreground are other Oriental elements. You can see obelisks, large symbols of the sun, and archaic temples. Schinkel uses these motives to reflect the contemporary enthusiasm for the Orient. The contrast between light and shade underlines the dramatic dichotomy of the Magic Flute. Up to the present day, the Magic Flute remains the most performed of Mozart's operas. In its construction, the two acts and the comic figure of Papageno, it is an opera buffa. On the other hand, it also contains elements of opera seria. Tamino's strivings for the Temple of Wisdom represent a typical motive of this genre. Moreover, the Magic Flute also has Baroque elements. The scene changes in full view of the audience. Immense stage machinery was necessary for a production of this opera.
Emanuel Schikaneder commissioned the work. He was the theatre director of the Freihaus Theatre, a theatre in the suburbs. A picture in this area conveys an idea of what the Freihaus Theatre looked like. Schikaneder himself wrote the libretto for the Magic Flute. The synopsis is mostly based on the anthology of fairy tales Dschinnistan, or Select Fairy Tales by Christoph Martin Wieland. Mozart made good progress on the opera. The first performance of the German opera took place on September 30th, 1731. Schikaneder played and sang the role of Papageno. You can see him in this role in the exhibition. The opera was a phenomenal success. In October alone of the same year, the Magic Flute was performed a further 20 times. The Freemasons were a society rather like a club, whose aim was to implement humanity, tolerance and fraternity. They formed an important platform for discussions, not subject to censorship. Therefore, it's hardly surprising that many artists and intellectuals were members of various Masonic lodges. Freemasonry experienced its culmination in the time of Emperor Joseph. Most relevant intellectuals were organized in Masonic lodges and usually advocated Joseph II's reform process. The euphoric mood subsided, however, when Joseph II tried to gain control over the Freemasons. The emperor, who was aiming to impose centralism, was suspicious of secret societies. From 1784, Mozart was a member of the lodge Charity. When Joseph II abolished this, Mozart was accepted into the lodge, New Crowned Hope.
The Freemasons possess a rich language of symbols. This has its origins in the long tradition of the lodges. The roots of Freemasonry lie in the medieval fraternities of the Masons' guilds. The first documents to mention the Freemasons dates from the 14th century. There are clear references to Freemasonry in the Magic Flute. Mozart also composed songs to Freemasonic texts.
The lodges of the Freemasons were, for the most part, male societies. It's all the more astonishing that in Mozart's Magic Flute, not only Prince Tamino, but also Pamina are accepted into the circle of the initiated. Indeed, Pamina takes Tamino along the path of the great trials through water and fire. This installation takes you to the garden of Schönau. These gardens were greatly renowned in the 18th century. Having made a fortune through fabulous speculations, Baron Peter Braun was one of the richest men in Austria. He used 1,000,000 gulden to transform a huge area of land about 50 kilometers south of Vienna into an enchanting landscape with temples, grottos, arbors, lawns, and woods. The garden was the scene of indescribably luxurious festivities. For a hunt with horses and hounds, for example, a huge amount of salt was brought in to portray a winter's sleigh ride in the middle of summer. From the many inscriptions in the garden structures, it can be seen that a concept of the Freemasons formed the basis for planning and designing the gardens. Braun, like Mozart, was a Freemason. It may be assumed that this legendary garden inspired Mozart's descriptions of the gardens in the Magic Flute.
The room in front of you is devoted to the theme of science in the 18th century and deals in particular with scientific criteria for assembling collections. You will have noticed the wax figure lying on display. This was made for the use of medical students for anatomical study. The depiction of human organs, bones and blood vessels was regarded as both fascinating and instructive. In the 18th century, it was recognized that drawings were inadequate to represent the three-dimensional structure of the body. But since there was as yet no technique for preservation, body parts and organs were modelled in wax, as nearly lifelike as possible. The most important and best-known collection of these was in Florence.
Vienna, however, owned the largest collection of natural history exhibits, numbering over 30,000 objects. The meteorite exhibited here is one of the prize pieces of the collection. Emperor Franz Stephan of Lorraine, husband of Maria Theresa, founded the collection in 1750. The practical significance of the natural sciences was recognized. In particular, the potential for financial gains was seen in mineralogy. The famous mineralogist Ignaz von Born was appointed to Vienna to order and extend the collection. Mozart and Born knew each other well. They were both members of Freemasons' lodges.
The Albertina has an enormous collection and is a major centre for the academic study of the arts. Here you see books by Conte Durazzo, with whose help Albert Saxon von Teschen was able to build up the collection of graphic art. Ludwig Ritter von Köchel was employed as a music teacher at the Albertina, by the way, and spent several years here at the palace of the Albertina. It is to him that we owe the Köchelverzeichnis, the catalogue of the complete works of Mozart, which today still serves as the basis for new editions of the works. This catalogue has already been revised several times and is now in its 8th edition. In the spring of 1791, Franz Count of Walseck commissioned a requiem from Mozart for his late wife. The job was well paid, but Mozart was obliged to keep his authorship a secret. The Count wanted to pass off the work as his own. The score of the requiem here is open at pages 2 and 3. In contrast to Salieri's requiem, Mozart in no sense composed this Mass for the dead for himself, or had premonitions of his own approaching death. This perception emerged later, in the romantically inclined 19th century.
Count von Walseck did not need the requiem until the following year. This gave Mozart a little time. Nevertheless, he no longer managed to complete the requiem. Mozart became ill and died on December 5th, 1791 in Vienna. The cause of death was referred to as a feverish, shivering chill. In the last year of his life, he was also working on another sacred work, the Ave Verum Corpus, a motet for 4 voices. The autograph manuscript is exhibited here. Unlike the requiem, Mozart was able to complete the motet. The Ave Verum is moving because of its gripping simplicity. Listen to a recording played on period instruments. The Hilliard Ensemble and the choir of King's College, Cambridge is conducted by Stephen Cleabury. Mozart's wife Constanze, née Weber, entered the time of her husband's death into the family chronicle. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was buried in keeping with his status. There were strict rules according to Joseph II's sanitary laws about how a burial was to be carried out. At that time, the actual funeral ceremony did not take place at the cemetery. The final blessing was given in St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. Afterwards, the corpse was taken on a hearse to the St. Mark's Cemetery, which, like all cemeteries in those days, was situated outside the city. As was the custom, Constanze and friends accompanied the coffin to the city gates. 5 days later, Schikaneder organized a solemn memorial service. At the end of December, a concert was performed in honor of Mozart. The proceeds were given to his widow Constanze.
Constanze Mozart went about the expert editing and publishing of the works with a well-developed business sense. She entered into negotiations with the publishers Breitkopf and Hertel in Leipzig and Johann Anton André in Offenbach. In the end, she sold the latter all the autograph scores of her husband she still possessed. Constanze Mozart married a second time. Her husband was Nikolaus von Nissen, who was to write a major Mozart biography. She died in 1842 at the age of 80 in Salzburg. What proved impossible for Mozart in Vienna was a resounding success in Italy. For Milan, he wrote 3 operas, which had triumphant premieres there. These belonged to the genre opera seria, operas with a serious content on themes from mythology or Roman and Greek history. For the marriage in Milan of Maria Theresia's son Ferdinand to the heiress of the Duke of Modena, Mozart wrote the serenata Ascanio in Alba. This work by the 15-year-old was a much greater success than the opera by the 72-year-old composer Johann Adolf Hasse, composed for the same occasion. Mozart travelled right through Italy with his father. This journey had not only a professional aspect. For father and son, it was also a grand tour. Among their stopovers were Milan, Bologna, Rome, Naples and Venice. During his 3 Italian journeys in the years from 1769 to 1773, the child prodigy developed into a young composer.
When Mozart was 14 years old, he successfully passed the examination for the Accademia Filarmonica in Bologna. In the display case, you can see the original autograph of the piece Mozart wrote for the exam. Mozart was the talk of the town in Rome because he had been able to write down from memory Allegri's Miserere, a choral work in 9 parts lasting 1 hour, after hearing it only once. A special honour was bestowed on Mozart by the Vatican. Pope Clement XIV awarded him the Order of the Golden Spur. In Italy, Leopold and Wolfgang hoped to achieve more than merely writing successful operas. Above all, they were keen to find an attractive court appointment for the young Mozart. These plans failed, however. First of all, in Milan, at the court of Ferdinand, whose mother, Maria Theresa, emphatically advised against employing travelling riffraff, such as the Mozarts. After the successful performance of Lucio Silla, the third opera Wolfgang composed for Milan, the Mozarts had hopes of an appointment at the court of one of Maria Theresa's other sons, Grand Duke Leopold of Tuscany, who later became Emperor Leopold II. This plan failed too. Mozart had to return to Salzburg, to the city where he no longer had any desire to live. After the long years of successful journeys throughout Europe, this was a severe blow to his career. Leopold Mozart wrote to his wife,
God has other plans for us. We are, praise God, in good health.
Here in front of you, you can see the examination work in which Mozart proves in 21 bars that he was in full command of the rules of harmonic theory and strict method of composition. Padre Martini corrected the work. Mozart copied the corrected work. You can see it with the corrections included alongside. Leopold wrote to his wife in Salzburg.
He had it finished in half an hour. Thereupon the caretaker brought the certificate to the house. It is written in Latin. It is a particular honour for him, since the Accademia is over 100 years old, and apart from Padre Martino and other notable Italians, the most admired men from other nations are also members of this Accademia Bononiensis.
Pope Clement XIV awarded Mozart the Golden Spur on June 26, 1770. Never before had such a young person been given this honour. A few days later he was received personally by the Pope in a private audience. The picture shows you Mozart with the Golden Spur, the highest secular distinction that the Vatican can bestow. This order was awarded to Mozart in the highest class and entitled him to describe himself as a knight. He proudly signed a letter to his sister in Salzburg with the words Chevalier de Mozart. Nevertheless, he never used the knight's title.
The opera Ascanio in Alba was a commission on the occasion of the marriage of Maria Theresia's son Ferdinand to Maria Ricciarda Beatrice of Modena. The marriage had been arranged when bride and bridegroom were still infants. This union gave the Habsburgs the security of a politically useful connection between their two main areas of influence within Italy, Lombardy and Tuscany. During the wedding celebrations, the entire town was transformed into a festival stage. As with the opera Mitridate Re di Ponto a year before, the festival opera Ascanio in Alba was a great success with the public. In front of you is the autograph score of this opera, composed by Mozart at the age of 15. You can now listen to the aria Per la gioia in questo seno from Ascanio in Alba. The role of Aceste is sung by Peter Schreier. The Staatskapelle Dresden is conducted by Ottmar Suitner.
gioia il questo seno l'alma Dio balza mi sento al neccesso del contento non resistere non sa non resistere con me felici siete, sì con me felici siete. Ah, venite, venite, dividete il piacer che in cor mi sta, il piacer, il piacer. Se con me felici siete, ah, venite, il piacer che in cor mi sta, che in cor mi sta. Resistere non sa. Resistere non sa. Per la gioia in questo seno l'alma Dio balza mi sento al eccesso de contento non resistere non sa non resistere
On millions of pixels, we can see a reproduction of a ceiling fresco by the great Venetian rococo artist Giovanni Battista Tiepolo.
Can you see how animated the trapeze artist is? The painter Oliver Lash makes Tiepolo's tightrope walker sway to and fro. He's balancing precariously. The image shows the feelings of an artist who is exposed to everyone's gaze, who works without a safety net and constantly moves along a fine line between opposing poles.
Welcome to this major exhibition to celebrate the 250th birthday of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Here in the Albertina you will see the largest Austrian exhibition staged in connection with the composer. This exhibition presents the 18th century as a time of change. It illustrates well the contradictory trends of this period, the antitheses of reason and emotion, science and religion, and the clash between the individual and society. It will become clear what an influence the 18th century still exerts on our lives and our thinking today. Our approach to Mozart's time and personality is illustrated not only with the help of historical documents, but also with objects from the present day. Numerous installations by contemporary artists have been created specially for this exhibition. They interpret the genius of Mozart from a modern viewpoint. The Upper Austrian artist Klaus Pinter invites viewers into new areas of perception. His space installation focuses the gaze in new directions and reminds us of the possibility of changing perspectives. In this way, the hot air balloon is an emblem of the Mozart exhibition. The form is reminiscent of the flying machines of Mozart's time. In the last quarter of the 18th century in France, the Montgolfier brothers made the first experiments with hot air balloons. These attempts at flying had a festive atmosphere and attracted many inquisitive onlookers. You will see more graphics on this theme in the exhibition. The balloon afforded a novel view of what was already familiar. It opened up a new dimension. The new perspective enlarged the field of perception. Already at that time, balloon flight was recognized as a symbol for a new freedom. In the pattern on the carpet, you will discover ears and amorphous forms. On the one hand, these represent our sense organs for sounds and noises, but they also allow for erotic associations. The motives, color, and sensuousness of the carpeting are an allusion to the galant, decorative rococo, which was the cultural basis of Mozart's art. For the visitor, the carpet is a reticent but omnipresent escort throughout the exhibition. It was designed especially for this exhibition by the Viennese artist Franz West. You will notice that it is laid at an angle. Like the balloon, it also plays with the idea of the limits of space. Whether it is a matter of regret or inspiration when reflecting on Mozart, the fact is that we know of no picture of Mozart which allows us to draw conclusions about his character, or tells us exactly what he looked like. The picture installation makes it clear that there is no definitive picture of Mozart. On the contrary, a large number of pictures of him exist in parallel. He did not personally commission any of the portraits produced during his lifetime. They were not created by artists of exceptional talent. They come from admirers or acquaintances. It was not the aim of these pictures to record his likeness for posterity. They simply capture a particular moment in which Mozart's genius is revealed. Mozart himself had no particular interest in immortalizing his appearance. Even in his lifetime he consciously avoided exact categorization. He was adept at concealing his inner life. Even in the many letters, which seem such personal documents, he hardly shows his innermost feelings. They seem in fact rather stage-managed. Mozart's manner, whether personal, in his works or in his letters, is full of contradictions. For this reason, Mozart has always had many faces.